Hi, this is Larrabee, and I'll be talking about the well-tuned brain today. And this was a really dense text, so I took out a lot of the explanation of the economy and a lot of his mechanics and distilled this down into my takeaways. I'm going to talk quickly about the book overview. So, it's really interesting. Dr. Waybrow divided the book into two parts because, as he explains it, there are two parts of the brain. And so he really likes that kind of symmetry. The first part is about who do you think you are? And it talks about how we formulate identity within the construct of sort of neuroscience and society and philosophy. It's really a lot of complex identity building. And the second part is about how we live with this using our brains that are somewhat ancient in a modern world. And so the overview of the book is that our brains are complex learning machines, but have primitive wiring, and they really haven't adapted to 21st century life. The brain makes choices based on modern and ancient factors, and our brains have learned from behaviors and are tuned towards specific actions and thoughts. He uses the term tuned, the well-tuned brain, which is like the allusion to the well-tuned clavier, which is the instrument that was tuned in the 18th century to change the pitch. And there's a whole explanation of the title about how that's associated with early pianos. So it's a very comprehensive, complex book. So some of the takeaways: our brains are out of tune with this modern abundance due to a deep-seated dive for survival and biological hardwiring of habitual living. And I found this was very interesting because it basically says the more we do out of habit, the more the habit reinforces that behavior. One of the other points that I really liked was the fact that we live longer. The vast majority of our offspring survived childhood, were largely literate, and in developed economies, many individuals enjoy material comforts that for centuries were beyond the reach of kings. This quote really resonated with me because no matter how bad things get, I'm always contextualizing things that they're better than the past. And even in the global pandemic, our global pandemic is a lot better than a lot of other global pandemics. So this really struck me as a good quote to remember, because as bad as we think it is now, we have it so much better. So many of us have it so much better. So, and that really informs the wiring of our brain. And I'll get into that in a little bit later when we talk about abundance and poverty. So a large part of the book talks about economy and how the European economic and intellectual movements combine religion, philosophy, technology, and basically bring us to where we are now. And a lot of the parallels in this part of the book were very similar to what we talked about with the fairy book, where we looked at the Greek philosophy and the idea of identity with nature, and then the transformation through Christianity of this sort of sense of divinity outside of the self, coming from a higher being, and then into kind of going back into the age of enlightenment and then industrialization, where there's a sort of re-empowerment of what men are capable of. And so the real purpose of this book seems to have come out of the 2008 financial crisis, and that Dr. Weber was sort of driven to write this book because of the obesity epidemic and environmental crisis, which have a common behavioral root fed by affluence and a degraded neurological capacity for self-regulation. Basically that, all of this, the situation that we're in is this perfect storm that triggers our brain into a state of inaction. In the modern world, we tend to blame big business, government, or others for the crises that we face without taking individual responsibility for our impact. And he goes on to explain that there's a really good reason for this, that it's really hardwired into our brains, that some problems seem too big to worry about, so our brains can't process them as problems or drive us into action. And yet the problems cause this residual stress. And a good example is global warming. It's sort of lurking out there, and it's too big for us to really mentally tackle. So we can do little things, but the overall the big problem is still really too big for us to deal with our sort of Cro-Magnon brains. As I was reading this, there were a lot of comparisons I found between how he describes our ancient and modern brains selves, and those differences in our needs, and how it reminded me a lot of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and basically that you need to have a foundation of safety and security and food, water, air in order for you to be successful and to get other needs met. So yeah, going back into the issue of poverty and affluence, they both have a negative impact on the brain. And this I found really interesting, especially with my work at the Community College of Vermont, because we've studied a lot about how poverty impacts learning. And so this was really interesting because I knew a little bit about this part, but that both poverty and affluence have a negative impact. With affluence, you have the possibility of neurological atrophy from underuse, chronic boredom, increased need for happiness sort of hits, those dopamine hits that you get when you do something like, buy something on Amazon, and the drive for instant gratification, again, Amazon. And this is something I can definitely relate to. We've all been under so much stress because of the pandemic that, I think we've all noticed that there are these like instant hits that will give us that little hit of dopamine, and everybody's probably experienced those. With poverty, the brain constantly is flooded with stress hormones. It's just constantly marinating in sort of these cortisol levels of stress and hormones, and all the immediate need any immediate need becomes the priority. And short-term thinking is habitual and rewarded, which means you're kind of in this short-term cycle loop where you set up things in the short term and you're rewarded. So you really train your brain to only see in the short term. And there's also a drive for instant gratification. So both poverty and affluence have a drive for instant gratification because that's really where our brains are wired. And the modern American brain combines the poverty brain's sort of false sense of stress from our crisis media, which is the 24-hour news cycle, and the complacency of the affluent brain, because we have enough, most of us have enough shelter, we have enough food, a lot of us have clean drinking water. We have the basic resources for survival, which means our brains are turning into that sort of complacent. We're looking for what's next and what we can add on to that. And this was an interesting point about the sense of community, and that we now pay for things that we did or were done for us or to us by loved ones. And that leaves us feeling really disconnected. This really resonated with me because I'm a working mom and I don't have parents nearby. And so the idea of really feeling disconnected from my own family unit was really interesting. And knowing that, like, as I was doing this work, if it were 300 years ago, which of course I wouldn't be going to graduate school for 300 years ago, but I would have had a parent being able to take care of my kid while I do something, or I would have been having to take care of my parents while I was also doing, cooking dinner and doing all these things, which a lot of us still do, but I think that we've outsourced a lot of it. And societal caring elements that used to support us and give us deep satisfaction have been outsourced. And the term outsource was used in the book. So making things by hand, growing food, caring for the old and young, community obligations, home cooking, raising animals, all these things. And in some ways, a lot of us got back to this and found comfort in this during the COVID pandemic when we were sort of on lockdown. So it's funny that there was this very ancient brain drive to make bread and have gardens, because that was really gave us a deep satisfaction and a sense of connection, if not with other people, then as society as a whole, which I found really, that resonated a lot. I also love this quote. He goes and talks about Adam Smith, who was a 18th century economist, philosopher, scholar. But the quote that I really liked about this was that happiness consists of tranquility and enjoyment. And so I have this like stop and smell the roses element. That after all of this, that happiness, our brains are happiest when we have the time and the space to stop and smell the roses. And now for some takeaways and applications. So I have a set of leaders should slides here, because as I was going through this book, I was making notes about what he was saying about the brain and what that means in terms of what we should do as leaders to satisfy the needs of the brain. And so one of the things that kept coming up was this idea of gratification and instant gratification, and going back to that sort of dopamine hit. And so leaders should set a combination of short and long-term goals so that the need for instant gratification can be met while also keeping the future in sight. And an example of this, you can have things that are like little goals that are wellness activities, or like little photo contests that are like very short-term and low stakes, that are also part of team building, that are, if not goals, they're kind of, they're ways of having some sort of communal end result, and that can be part of the work structure as much as an actual productivity goal, and that the productivity goals are always long-term or often long-term, which can be really unsatisfying because they're just so drawn out. So that having smaller goals or smaller activities that reproduce the same effect of gratification can keep people going while they're working on those longer term goals. And we all know this, that leaders should cultivate an environment of caring so team members can feel valued and that they're part of a community. This kind of reminds me a lot of the sort of feminist lens of ethics that we went to with another class, the class that I was in before, and talking about caring ethics and how often this is something that is brought in with gender, is that leaders are nurturing a sort of environment of caring. So it's funny that this came in with a lens of gender. And I'm just bringing that up because of the readings that we've done recently in the last chapter of the textbook about that lens of gender. And so I thought this was really interesting because you can find ways of building that sort of care culture in with team members so they can demonstrate care to each other and take care of each other. And it's kind of a family network thing. It's a kind of a family sensibility. Things like rotating cleaning tasks or just cooking for each other, or even community gardens or office plants with people taking care of plants, like basic things like that can really help to build community. And then stress outlets can also be team building activities, things like yoga, meditation classes, incentivized nutrition, wellness, fitness activities, social things like book clubs. Of course, as a librarian, book clubs are the first thing that come to mind, but social groups, trivia nights, that kind of thing, often we see those as extras. And so those extras that might get cut or might get marginalized in the work environment really need to be integrated and fluid within the team dynamics so that the team can kind of survive all of the stress that happens. Leaders should listen. Communication that validates stressors and validates team members' fears should go hand in hand with the stress prevention and outlet activities. So in addition to preventing stress and trying to do activities that will offset stress, it's really important to really validate and listen to the fears and give those fears and concerns the proper respect that they deserve. And I know this mostly from being a parent, and my parenting experience is what I have that informs this concept more than anything. The other thing that I kept thinking about as a parent is that leaders should make all of these anti-stress opportunities and team building opportunities to working parents. So offering activities that are during work hours so parents don't have to schedule one more thing, having like lunchtime yoga is really nice. Using mobile-based communication tools to make sure everyone is involved in work and social conversations. This was something that was really tremendous during the pandemic because I found that I was using my phone constantly to keep track of work conversations. And a lot of our traditionally hallway conversations that are really important, those are the conversations where you sometimes really get the problem solved. Those were all happening through Microsoft Teams. And so the fact that I could use my phone when I was running errands or as I was doing laundry at home, or when I was, when you're trying to juggle working at home and working constantly, that I could be involved in those conversations and not feel left out. So it actually made those conversations more inclusive, which I found really interesting. And the same thing with Zoom. We often did socialization after hours or during during hours, just as a social thing. We'd have like Friday coffees or doing something over Zoom so that we could all feel like, even though everyone is over Zoom, that we could take a break and do something that didn't have to feel productive. This is an important one. Leaders should perform regular skill and task inventories to ensure equity in workload and optimal alignment of skill sets. This is really, really sort of management leadership talk here. And I'm going to talk about how it's informed by the neuroscience in the book, because when you feel overloaded or you feel like things are unequal, then that spikes your cortisol levels and it drives up that fear factor in your brain. And so making sure that you're not feeling that things are unfair or that you're overloaded or overwhelmed is a really important component, and that you can incorporate assessments into professional development opportunities. So things like moderated skill personality assessments, like having somebody come in and do the, what color rainbow parachute you are, or whatever, what quadrant are you, or Myers-Briggs or whatever assessment that people often find really helpful in terms of self-reflection and feeling valued, or just knowing how they fit into a team. Brainstorming sessions across departments, getting people from different areas together, and having regular shadowing and mentoring sessions at all levels. And I think that's really helpful, not only in terms of breaking boundaries, but making sure that people feel that their work is being seen and that they're valued. This is one that I like particularly because I'm a very creative person and I like to infuse my work with my own creativity, and that leaders should infuse work with creativity and opportunities to demonstrate individual ownership. Humans are creators, and integrating creativity tasks can build esteem and increase job satisfaction. So, things like design, color, input about how offices are set up or locations of offices, and freedom to personalize workspaces, and also rotating leadership roles so that it's not just one person who's in charge of brainstorming and problem solving. You can rotate that around because there's a lot of creativity involved in problem solving that we don't think of in terms of creativity, but sort of creative problem solving is also part of that. And this was really one of the big takeaways from the book, but also the course, that leadership isn't a set of skills, but rather the behavior of a self-actualized individual who can put ideas into collaborative action. And this is just me saying this. This is not a quote from the book. And I really found that when I was reading this, it really echoed a lot of what I learned from the textbook and our readings from the fairy book, because it's really not about learning leadership traits or trying to aspire to having leadership traits as much as it is just being a good person and figuring out who you are and knowing your strengths and weaknesses, and then just doing something you're passionate about, and that makes you a natural leader. And I think that's just sort of the big takeaway from all of this. So that is the review of The Well-Tuned Brain. It's a big book. It's a lot of thoughts. I really enjoyed it, and it was, it's the kind of complex thing that I really enjoy. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation as well.